I'm going to go to share screen, as I have learned how to do. Go here, go here, go here. That turned out properly?
Yes, looks great. Thank you.
Well, it's just as a bit of an aside, I'm actually in Central Oregon at the moment. And the wonders of modern technology, I drove down to spend a few days at my daughter's in Oak Ridge, Oregon, and it's cold, probably 40 out here and misting. It's on the west side of the crest, but Deirdre mentioned that it's supposed to be 21 in the Methow and it threatens snow, and just that's what we all deal with as if we're gardeners and if we're trying to garden. And in the Methow, I mean, so my daughter is enthused. They've been here a year, and she's enthused at how easy it is to grow food here on the west slope of the Cascades at a lowish elevation. They're not very high. I don't know what it is, 1,000 or 2,000 feet, I'm guessing, in Oak Ridge. But it's moist. It's moist at warm, but it won't. But they have warm summers, and it is more ideal, I would say, than the Methow. And the two issues that, as far as I'm concerned, that we face in the Methow are it's cold so often, so much of the year, and so one of the things that I have mentioned previously and that I have to talk about is extending the season in places like the Methow, because that's of great interest to me, because I like to grow more of my own food, and I am into greens. So I eat a lot of salads, even for dinner. I might put something a little more solid in there than lettuce, but it's meaningful to me to be able to grow vegetables in an extended way in the cool climate of the Methow. The other thing in the Methow is it's so dry in the summer, and that's been a problem for me, and it comes out in this conversation, especially when I talk about potatoes. It's because there's some things that nothing likes to dry out. Anyhow, the challenges of growing food in the Methow. So there's a few slides that are repeats from last week, and I thought, sort of the chemistry aspect, I thought it was worth repeating. For one, we can't remember these things. None of us, including myself. I mean, if you get into the science of some of this material, but it's also rich and fascinating. And I think for me, it deepens my sense of what I'm doing when I'm gardening, when I realize, maybe I'll go to the next slide, which is that ecology lineup, that really I am being an ecologist with the best of my ability, and dealing with the ecology in the garden, but the ecology of life. And so we touched on these last week. I'm briefly just reminding, and it's notable. Energy, we don't really think about energy, and if we think about energy, we think it comes from the gasoline pump or electrical wire, but really most of the energy available on the planet, 99.9% of it, comes from the sun. And so the idea of gardening is to capture that energy, and probably capture it beyond what we usually think of. We think of, well, the plants, photosynthesis, of course, the plants are going to capture that energy. But we will also, as I mentioned last week, and I will reiterate this week, plants capture that energy in hydrocarbon bonds, hydrogen carbon bonds. The energy of the sun is in those bonds. And when those bonds break up, when oxygen pulls the hydrogen away from the carbon, it gives off energy that's available for life. So if we can get plant material into the soil, we're actually putting energy into the soil. I don't think it's really commonly thought about that way, but it is true. And it's interesting to think about it that way. So water is not always available. It flows from the sky sometimes. And the idea with ecosystems and the garden is to retain the water as long as possible in a healthy way. You don't want the soil saturated. How you do that? Put organic matter the same way you put energy in. You put organic matter in the soil, and it soaks up water. I mean, sphagnum moss, which we don't really have. I mean, we have sphagnum in the Methow, but we don't have peat beds. Sphagnum holds something like 10 times its weight in water, and all organic material absorbs water. And so that's what we're doing when we put organic matter. And then the nutrients. And so nutrients, sunshine's coming from outer space, water's coming from the sky, and the nutrients were all delivered 4.5 million years ago. And it's interesting to think about that because humans haven't learned that. And so we think we can throw things away, but nature throws nothing away. I mean, as I might have said last week, I asked children at school, where does nature put its garbage? And they try to figure it out. But there is no garbage. It's just really stunning that there's no garbage in nature. 20 million species and no garbage. And I think we're on a learning curve. I don't blame it on humanity that we have so much garbage or we're so unecological. None of the other creatures think about ecology, but I think it's to our credit that we're on that path. And this is part of the path. Soil is the basis for life. I had to think about that. You can grow plants hydroponically with no soil. Why is it the basis for life? And my answer is because of the 3 points above, that soil stores energy, water, and nutrients. And hydroponics is just an artificial environment, but soil is not. And I changed number 5. I forget exactly what I had on 5. You can't have too many of any one species, something like that. And I changed it to really no one species can dominate. And in an ecosystem, so that the balance of species does change all the time. And that was the problem I had with the previous statement. It changes all the time, but there's either always a balance or the balance is regained. Because it's an interdependent community of life, and the different organisms have a job to do in that ecosystem. And again, we don't tend to think of things in that way, and I don't think I should try to go into that any further, but you can certainly intuit what that means. I showed this last week, and I'm showing it again because I'm just fascinated by this, the balance of biomass on the planet, and just the fact that most of the biomass are plants. That's gigatons or billions of tons, 450 gigatons. So those are the 6 kingdoms of life, somewhat arbitrary, but somewhat accurate. There are 6 kingdoms. Viruses do not have a kingdom. Viruses are on the edge, It's argued whether they have any life to themselves or not. Anyhow, just the balance. Bacteria, I would say that's conjectural. I don't think we know. Nobody can weigh the bacteria. But the point here is plants dominate because only photosynthetic organisms can, in a sense, create themselves. They make that plant body out of the energy of the sun and gases in the atmosphere, mostly. And I do talk a little more about that. This is a little, because I didn't show this last week. Sorry, did that by itself. This is biomass by environment, the upper one, biomass by environment. Terrestrial biomass, the brown, compared to marine. How surprising is that? Most of the biomass on the planet is terrestrial. There's very little biomass in the oceans, and it's not because we fished it all out. It's just the nature of land versus ocean in its capacity to support biomass. I just find it fascinating. So they see that 470 is almost the same number as the 450. That's what plants were. Most of that weight is plants. In the deep subsurface, about 70, that again is conjectural. People don't know. But another very interesting phenomenon is the little insert at the bottom. It's sort of percent biomass. So terrestrial, it shows producers, the weight of producers, and that's the 450 that were plants, 450 gigatons, compared to consumers. You can't have one would think you could not have consumers without producers. The producers create the food and the consumers eat it. And a lot of energy is lost when biomass is broken down and the energy is released. When that hydrocarbon bond is broken, most of the energy is given off as heat. It's not a very efficient process. There have to be fewer consumers than producers. So the surprise is, look at the marine environment. There are more consumers than producers. And I am shocked every time I see that. And we're not going into it because this is not marine biology, but you can Google it or you can try and figure it out. And it's just a fascinating fact. How could there be more consumers than producers? Anyhow, these are just great little graphs that make us wonder about life. I wanted to reiterate, I do have some new information here, but I wanted to reiterate what's going on, that it's a shock. I mean, the whole biological dynamic is really a shock, and it's very close to a miracle, to miraculous on the grand scale and on the microscopic scale. So just this fact that I put in at the bottom, the biosphere is really appearing out of the atmosphere because it's mostly carbon dioxide. And to take that a step further, this is a little chart of the composition of various parts of the universe, but this is out from Wikipedia. I think I typed these in, but I took them from a chart I got off of Wikipedia, and I cut out, they had the universe and they had some other things. I narrowed it down. But let's take something like carbon. The Earth is only 0.07% carbon. The Earth's crust has almost no carbon. The oceans have almost no carbon. Humans are 18% carbon, and plants are 45% carbon. And so there's a great statement that's occasionally made in biology that living things are far from equilibrium with the environment. And this is what we're looking at right now. How can animals, humans, plants have so much carbon when there's so little on the Earth, anywhere on the Earth? Even in the atmosphere, it's only 500 parts per million, and life concentrates it. And so my claim is that biomass is 90% carbon. We'll look at biomass. Well, most biomass is plants. Look at what else is high in the plant composition. Oxygen. Carbon dioxide is CO2. These things I just think are mind-blowing. And the other major component of biomass is hydrogen. So if you add up 45, 45, that's 90, and then hydrogen, which comes from water, is 6% in plants, so that's 96% of the plant. And I wish I had nitrogen on here, but these critical elements, phosphorus, look at how much phosphorus, 0.2% in a plant. That's how much weight it takes. Potassium more, but only 1%. Nitrogen, I don't know, I forget. I've seen it, but I forget. So that's both the fact that it is true that the biomass is appearing out of the atmosphere, but plants also, you can't live with these lower percentage elements, but they're minor components. We did this last time, and I just wanted to reiterate that in this formula, carbon dioxide plus water here, the water is broken apart by the energy of the sun. That's photosynthesis. The hydrogen is attached to the carbon dioxide to make sugar. There's energy stored in that hydrogen-carbon bond. And so methane, well, the two things I wanted to reiterate here is the energy is stored in the hydrogen-carbon bond. It's when that bond is broken, energy is given off, and that energy is available to life, is available for life to function. And the other thing is that magic that I talked about last week, that these electron shells have a preference. I wanted to look up how many atoms can you fit on the head of a pin, and I forgot to do it. It's probably 1 trillion. We're talking about, infinitesimally small, and they have preferences. The universe has preferences. And so there are statements by physicists that say, there's one, I was looking at it this morning and I wasn't able to write it down. It said that, so I'm not suggesting religion, and I'm not suggesting God. This is reality, and it's not necessarily God, and it's not necessarily religion. It's just it is at the least a minor miracle that this structure is built in to the universe, that these elements appeared and they have preferences for how they want to join up with the other elements. It's a stunning phenomenon. And so here, this is a structural diagram of cellulose. So plant materials are made up mostly of cellulose, and I have lignin coming up down below. So lignin is wood. So most plant material, even trees are 75% cellulose and 25% lignin. So they're only 25% wood. And wood is a stiffening structure that makes it possible for plants to grow upright in the way that they do. And I think the plants in our garden don't have lignin, they have cellulose. But what I wanted to point out here is look at how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium there is in cellulose. None. It's all the carbon isn't showing up, but the carbon are these little stretchy things here. It's carbon, oxygen, and hydrogen. And if I pull up the formula for lignin is incredibly complex. It's complex that when lignin was invented by life, no organisms could break it down. See, it has the energy of the sun in those carbon-hydrogen bonds, and the circles are carbon rings here. I'm going to spin that slowly. Somebody said I made him dizzy last week so it's carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. There in the basic structure, there is no phosphorus, no nitrogen, and no potassium. And all of these bonds have the energy of the sun in them, but lignin is so complex that it probably took 500 million years, at least 100 million years, for any living organisms to learn how to break wood down. And it's thought that the reason there's so much coal from 300 million to 400 million years ago is because the lignin, this hydrocarbon material, was falling onto the earth and into the swamps, and there was nothing to break it down. And so it was compressed by the weight of accumulation of sediment and compressed into coal and became coal. There's maybe no coal being made today because now fungi know how to break down lignin, and to some degree bacteria as well. And if you can break it down, it releases energy. So how do we get the energy of the sun into the soil? That's really part of the story of gardening, from a biological perspective. I know this is a little different, but to me, it's an interesting way to approach it. Well, you have to get organic matter into the soil. You either do it through composting or through cover crops. The next picture is cover crops. So this is me working on my compost pile. And I baby this thing. I think this was maybe last fall. So it's all undecomposed. I just built it. And that's all the plant material from the last year's garden, piling it up, layering it. We talked about that last week, layering green plant material with brown plant material to get the carbon nitrogen ratio, what the decomposing bacteria need to break it down, 20-1, 30-1. You can't measure it, you just layer green and brown. And if you have manure, that's good. It's higher in nitrogen. It's hard to get nitrogen. Nitrogen is, well, for one thing, it volatilizes into a gas and goes into the atmosphere. So, and so this compost pile is sitting there. I have put some manure on it. I have not yet. I'm gonna cover it with plastic because I live. Look at that landscape behind. I live in a semi-arid environment, and everything dries out as dry as a bone. So I water it every week with those little rectangular sprinklers that has the shape of the compost pile, and put the plastic back on. And every Sunday, religiously, I water my compost pile, and it breaks down without turning it, because these things, there must be tons of organic matter there. It's hard enough to dig it out in the fall and put it on the garden once. I don't want to have to turn it. So compost pile, we're trying to get this. How are we going to get the energy of the sun into the soil to feed the soil community? And the other way are cover crops. And I think maybe I showed this last week, but cover crops are good even in a small garden. You can have a little plot. In fact, my daughter and I yesterday were digging out some, it was a grass, I think it was rye. It was hard to get out. The soil here is totally different than in the Methow. In fact, our soil, we haven't talked about that. Our soil in the Methow is not naturally good, but it is sandy, and it's better to start with sand than with clay. You can easily enrich sand. I mentioned last week, I took all the rocks out. I screened the soil, which I thought was just incredibly much fun. and then put organic matter in. So this little book up here, booklet, is available for free. If you were to write down that title and Google it, you can download it and read about building soils. And of course, there's all kinds of information. That was an accident. I bought some of this. This is called Sorghum Sudan grass. It's a hybrid, human-made hybrid. It grows 8 feet tall. I bought some seed. It was cheap, $20 for a big bag. You cannot grow it. You cannot grow it when it's freezing. So I'm going to plant it on June 1st or so. I did for cover crop. I have some terrible soil. I'm trying to improve it. I planted spring rye. That's what the picture in the upper right, upper left is. It looked like that. I didn't take that picture, but that's what it looked like. It grew great. I just had to water it. And then I tilled it into the soil and I planted it again. When the snow melted on April 1st, I planted it again. I'll grow spring rye until June 1st, and then I'm going to plant this sorghum. And yeah, it's just, you don't need big equipment for sorghum. That'd be hard to handle. I have a tractor, but the other stuff is easier to handle. Certainly if you have a tiller. Crimson clover is great. Should mention, all the pea family plants fix nitrogen. The atmosphere is 78% nitrogen, unavailable plants. It has to be made available by this process called fixing. I looked it up. What does fixing nitrogen mean? And there was not a good definition. That's the term they constantly use. Certainly putting it into a chemical form that plants can use. In the atmosphere, it's locked up as N2, two atoms hooked together. So cover crops. So getting on to the garden, which to some degree I have somewhat less to say, but just for timing. So I think Deirdre mentioned in the mailing about if you Google Methow Naturals, you get the Methow Naturals webpage, and there are two columns. There's a picture in the middle, and there's a column on the left and column on the right, and they're all clickable. And at the bottom of the right column, there is cover crops for the Methow. There's a chart we put together 15 years ago, cover crops for the Methow. Annika and Hans and Smith and I think. And there's another one that called a planting guide for the Methow, planting guide for the Methow. And I'd like to look at it and see if I still think it's the same, but it's roughly accurate. So when do you plant in the Methow? The problem with the Methow is the soil state. Snow doesn't melt until the end of March, and the soil's cold. We have cold days. It's going to go down to 21, like Deirdre said. So it's just hard to get things to grow and we want to plant. There's bare ground in April. Well, you can plant some things. So I'm going to say here, you can plant these crops and maybe a couple others: carrots, beets, lettuce, spinach, arugula. They're going to do way better if you cover them with row cover cloth. They're going to be far happier, but they will germinate this time of year and they will grow. So in my garden outside now, Chase and I transplanted onions. They're out, and we transplanted some lettuce, and they look fine. And they can take, if it goes down to 21, it won't kill them. It's a little cold, but it won't kill them. 15 might kill them. Yes. So we're talking about planting these plants. I just pulled up on the upper left. That person's covering their crops with row cover cloth. The plants love it. As I have said, I think it makes everything more moderate. It doesn't get as cold and it doesn't get as hot. The plants like that. And then in the upper right, I'm recommending a broad fork. I went 20 years without really using a broad fork, and I like it now. I like it more every year. That one is expensive. That's a Johnny's broad fork. It's $250. You can get them for $100, but I particularly recommend broad forks for carrots, because carrots, they have to penetrate the soil, and the soil gets compacted by us walking on it and even running our tillers on it. And the broad fork loosens it up. It depends on your soil. We were using a broad fork on my daughter's soil, the clay soil here, and I couldn't get it in more than halfway. And then it was coming up in kind of clods, and she says, let's just forget it. But she's not planting carrots there. So just be appraised to the fact that broad forks exist, and they're good tools, especially for deep crops that want to go deep. So anytime I plant carrots now, I use a broad fork, my $100 broad fork. What do we have here? So these are some cold season crops. beets, arugula. I'm calling attention to the fact that there is this kind of spinach called winter giant. I know if there's a seed company called Fedco Seeds. So you can Google Fedco Seeds. I looked it up 2 days ago. And then, they have a search box and you type in winter giant spinach and they have it. And I don't know why people grow anything else, because you get 3 times as much spinach with this winter giant spinach, but only in the spring and the fall. If you plant it on June 1st, it'll barely germinate and it won't grow. It's a fascinating thing. I don't know if it's day length or heat or both, but in the spring and in the fall, if you plant it on August 1st, and that would be a winter gardening date, it would do fine in the garden, and it would do even better in the greenhouse. I think I have a flea beetle here. No, do I? Flea beetle, yeah. So the only word, beets for me, beets are easy to grow. The only word I have to say about beets is, for some reason, they come up with 2 seedlings from 1 seed, and it's too crowded. So you have to go through on your hands and knees and thin them. But other than that, decent soil, and they're not deep rooted. The beets, only 3 inches deep. They're easy to grow, but I always am careful to thin them. And arugula is easy to grow, as you know, but there's a huge problem with flea beetles in the Methow. They haven't appeared yet. I have arugula from last year. It came up in the greenhouse and it's big. It's more than a foot tall, and I've been eating it. There's flea beetles, but they will show up when the weather warms up. So all you need to do is cover it with row cover cloth, and they can't figure out how to get in there. So again, the magic of row cover cloth. Just some basic things I've learned from the School of Hard Knocks. Cabbage family. Well, my daughter said an hour ago, do you think we could set out those brassicas? Well, she's here in Oregon, but I said yes. And so my advice for the Methow with the brassicas is plant them in trays, in little pots on April 1st. And I have not done that. And when I get home, that's the first thing I'm going to do is plant them in trays in the house. And they come up fast. They come up in about 5 days. And at least towards the end of April, that'd be great for setting them out. Now, I did start actually already long ago, broccoli and cauliflower, and I put them in the greenhouse, and they're doing great. They're cool weather crops. They like cool weather. They do better in May and June than they'll do in July and August. So just some dates for planting. And this, this is similar, actually. I mean, I'm in a very different environment here in Oregon, but it's not that different. So this page is about soil blocks, which I don't use, but I thought we should mention that they exist, and they're highly thought of by larger commercial growers. I mean, I make a little money commercially because my garden grows far more than I can eat. But I've never gotten into soil blocks. But so you may know about this, just a few words about it. It is possible to make, it's like making a little soil pot, but of course there's no plastic. It's just soil. You use a recipe that you can find online. It's close to a potting soil recipe. Actually, we just looked at it this morning, and the main thing they add is perlite, which is those little white rocks. And that's because you have to compress it to get it to hold together. And so you see that big soil block maker in the middle has that big handle on it. You have to push down on it with a spring, and you have to compress it or it won't stick together. So you put the perlite in because it's airy and it retains oxygen in the soil. The advantage of these soil blocks, one is you don't need plastic. And so you don't end up with all these plastic little pots. I have hundreds of little plastic pots, none of which I've bought. They just accumulate and I save them. It's a little better. It's better for the plant. A soil block is better for the plant because you don't disturb the roots when you plant the soil block. You're just putting the plant and the soil into the ground, and the roots don't wrap around the soil block the way they do in a plastic container if they're in the soil container. If they're in the plastic container too long, they have their advantages. It takes time, and there are some problems. Soil block might fall apart. So I've never gotten into them, but I thought this was interesting. You can make your own. You don't need to buy that soil blocker in the middle. Costs like $140. The other ones cost The one on the upper left costs about 35. The one on the bottom, somebody made out of tin cans. The one on the lower left is a piece of plastic pipe. It'd be easy to make. And here's one made out of a tin can, upper right. So I never even thought of that until I saw pictures of it. It'd be so easy to make soil blockers, but I don't do it. Hot crops. So the thing with hot crops for people like those of us who live in the Methow is we do everything too early. That's my impression. We want to start them in March, and so then the tomatoes, the tomatoes are just weeds, and they get so big in the windowsill. I have to, on May 1st, I have to put them out into the cold frame on the porch, and then by May 15th, they're pushing up against the cold frame, bending over. And so I put them out on May 20th. It's too cold. You can put a tomato out on May 20th, but you better not put your peppers and eggplants out. I put my eggplants out May 5th, June 1st. They hate it. And they get smaller. For the first 2 weeks, they get smaller and smaller. And last year, I thought I'd have no eggplants. And then when the soil warmed up, they started to grow. So, the main point there is, the lesson to me has been try and hold off and wait until the soil's warm, especially eggplants and peppers. They're tropical plants. They need warm soil. I keep trying. Let's see. I'm trying to think of the name for these little plastic tunnels. Like a mini greenhouse, which I have hoops for at least 100 feet of plastic tunnels, and they get too hot. If the sun comes out, they go up to 130 degrees. It's hard to roll them up, and if the wind comes up, it blows them out of the ground. So I've had a hard time with them. Barry Bernier does a good job with hers, and I wanted to stop by and see how she does it. Potatoes have been hard for me to grow, and it's partly because they need a constant environment. They don't want to dry out. Particularly, they don't want to dry out. Obviously, they don't want to be drenched. But I have some limitations on my water because of my solar system. I mean, the electricity, I only have so much electricity. So I have a problem. And if they get stressed, they get scab. Scab is present in almost all soil. And so my advice actually with potatoes is to mulch them, because mulch helps keep a constant environment. It keeps the soil a little cooler. It's good for potatoes, not good for tomatoes. And then mound them up, hill them. And I know this more from reading than from experience. It's hard for me to get the hilling. Just one more thing to do, and you just run out of energy, if not time. But in reading, it says you'll double your production if you hill them, because they grow up. Potatoes do not grow down. That was news to me. See, in that illustration, the potato that was planted is there in the middle. There are no potatoes below the one that was planted. They only grow up. So I'm trying to get better at growing potatoes. I have a lot of trouble with scab, and I think it's because they get stressed. So mulch. Mulch has advantages and disadvantages. I don't mulch very much, and if I were to, especially with organic material, hay or straw. And the reason I don't is it's a lot of work. I mean, it gets to be. You don't want to mulch until the soil's warm, say June 15th, maybe July 1st, if you're mulching a hot crop like tomatoes. Well, by July 1st, you have so much to do in the garden that it's hard to find time to break that mulch. It takes time to spread that mulch out. That's one disadvantage. Another disadvantage is if you don't mulch deeply enough, the weeds come up through the mulch, and then you can't hoe because the hoe hits the mulch. I've been very frustrated with that. But if you mulch 6 inches or more after the soil is warmed up, it's a tremendous thing to do for the soil, because that's organic matter. It's got the energy of the sun in the hydrocarbon bond. It's going to decompose over the course of the summer and go into the soil and greatly enrich your soil. It's like having a cover crop and an edible crop. So that would be organic material, but people also then mulch with landscape cloth. And I looked that up because I don't so much mulch with it. I'm not thinking of mulching. I have a maybe foot and a half wide strip of landscape cloth I put down between the eggplants and the peppers to heat the soil up. They're tropical plants. I plant them in June. They do, the moisture goes through the landscape cloth, so you're watering the soil, but the weeds can't get through it. I still like them, but if you read about them online, the deep organic gardeners don't like them because it's unnatural. It creates an unnatural environment in the soil. The soil can't breathe as well. And that's the same for cardboard, that lower picture. I was getting somewhat enthused about cardboard because it accumulates. If you say break down the boxes and keep them, it accumulates. It's organic, and I looked it up, and it's acceptable. It's not toxic. If it doesn't have printing all over it or tape. So then the objection was the same from the organic gardeners, was the same as the landscape cloth. It creates an artificial environment. Nature does not mulch with cardboard, and there's not as much oxygen exchange. The soil organisms are not as happy. These things are trade-offs, and everybody gets to make their own mind. I'm just pointing out there are these variabilities. I like organic mulch, and I bought a ton of hay, and I always mulched my garlic. That hay was full of the weed seeds of something called plantain. And then I fought with plantain all last summer. So then there's the the background story to the plants that we grow that we don't usually learn very much about. We know a little bit about corn. We know that all these plants were created by human beings. All the plants that we grow, there was no broccoli out there until humans, selective breeding. And corn is probably the greatest example of selective breeding on the planet, because as I show in some pictures coming, it's a grass. There are probably a few grasses that might grow 6 feet tall naturally, but here's the thing with corn that I hadn't really thought about until it was pointed out in reading about corn. You plant one kernel of corn and you get 600 kernels back. You get a 600 times return on your investment. It's an unbelievable crop. And you could almost live on corn. Maybe that's a bit of a stretch. It doesn't have complete protein. We all learned that, back in the old days. But corn and beans, that's what the Native Americans did. Corn and beans is a complete protein. You could live on it. And the other thing about these grains from grasses, corn and wheat, they probably would store for more than 100 years. If you can keep them dry and keep the animals out of them, you can live on them, and they store forever. They are impressive crops. These grasses are impressive crops. So corn's easy to grow, but it's yes. The other insight to me about corn, people would say corn's hard on the soil. It's a heavy feeder. It is a heavy feeder. How can you grow 6 feet tall and not be a heavy feeder? They advise adding some compost when it's a foot tall to feed it, because it's a heavy feeder. If you have that kind of compost, corn patch is usually pretty big. I don't usually add anything, and it does fine. But they say it's hard on the soil, and I realize that is not true. Corn is not hard on the soil. You are growing 6 feet of organic matter where previously there was just dirt. If you put the corn back into the soil, you are enriching that soil tremendously with organic matter. So then the question is how to get it back in the soil. And what I did for 15 years, more probably, I would dig that corn up with a shovel. It's hard to get it out of the ground. I'd have to slice each one out on both sides, pull it out, pile it up, carry it over to a chopper shredder, and feed it into a shredder chopper. And then it made this wonderful, wonderful pile of organic matter, which is like grass clippings. It would immediately start to decompose because it's so moist if you did it when it was green. And then I'd use that for green on the compost pile, the green and the brown, that would be green, already starting to decompose. A lot of work, take hours and hours. Now, and you don't have this option, most of you. So corn's work, but for me, it's no longer work because now I have a little John Deere tractor with a tiller. And when the corn's done, I drive into the corn patch with the tiller, and the tractor knocks the corn over, and the tiller tills it up, chops it up into pieces, and turns it into the soil. There are pieces of it sticking out, but that's the end of September. So it breaks down all winter long. And I've already planted wheat in the place that I had corn last year, and the corn has disappeared. But all of that organic matter that previously did not exist is now turned into the soil and will slowly break down and release its energy. So I'm impressed with corn as a soil improver if you get the plant material back into the soil. So corn is strange. And I don't know to what degree teosinte did this, the predecessor to corn, but corn grows a tassel that's a foot long. And that is the male, that's the female style that goes to the ovary where the egg is. And the pollen has to land on somewhere on that silk and grow a pollen tube. So the picture actually shows this pollen grain here has stuck to the tassel and it's growing a pollen tube, and it has to grow a pollen tube a foot long. I mean, it's just another magic trick. And then it delivers the male DNA. And I Googled around, how does that DNA travel through that pollen tube? I could not find out. You know, it's not flagellated. It doesn't have a tail. How does it move through that pollen tube? I do not know. But that's how corn gets pollinated, and it's astonishing. So teosinte, the predecessor, had a similar arrangement. I don't know to what degree, but here's the predecessor, the ancestor of corn, teosinte. I think there's a picture of teosinte. Well, no, nobody's going to live on teosinte, but Native Americans started probably gathering it for food and then selective breeding it. See, I looked these numbers up. The first wheat was cultivated 11,000 years ago. The first rice 10,000 years ago, and the first corn 9,000 years ago. And one of the great points of the big history story, which is the evolution of Homo sapiens, is that agriculture arose independently on different continents at almost the same time, separated by 1,000 years, in the Middle East, in China, and in the Americas, without any contact between these cultures, as if it was a natural outgrowth of human development. It's just interesting to ponder. Yeah. So they went from teosinte to corn, but it's selective breeding too. It's not genetic manipulation. So wheat is another grain. Wheat was the first grain of the three I just mentioned, and probably of all, they're all grasses: wheat, corn, rice. They're all grasses, grass family. They're flowering plants, but they're wind pollinated, so they're not showy flowers. Wheat was the first one to be cultivated, and it's always been work until the invention of the combine. And so this is a picture from Europe where they've been trying to cultivate harvest the wheat. It's easy to grow. Wheat is easy to grow and hard to harvest. And so I tried it last year, and I found I had the same problem. So this is me after cutting my wheat last year, and it's just supposed to be a joke. I was trying to look like the picture of the upper picture. So I grew this wheat last year, and I hate to admit it, all that wheat there, I got 40 pounds of wheat. That's not very much, but I'm getting better at it. It is 40 loaves of bread. It's not, it's almost a year's supply for one person, but it's a project. So let's see here what we have. This is the cultivation of wheat, grass. So the grass family, the upper picture map of the world shows the grass family covering 40% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. Prior to the cultivation of grasses by humans, it covered 20%. And it's sort of what's that book, The Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan? He says these plants have actually domesticated Homo sapiens. They've gotten people to plant them all over the planet. And so we've planted grasses all over the planet. Now they cover 40% of the Earth's land surface because of the wheat. corn and rice. So that's a scythe made out of a jawbone with rock blades on it in the middle. That's just some of the evidence for harvesting wild wheat 12,000 years ago, which led to cultivated wheat 11,000 years ago. Göbekli Tepe, I think most of you have heard of it. It's a ceremonial site that was discovered 30 years ago in Turkey. And it has these huge stone blocks. It's 12,000 years old. It was built before wheat was domesticated. They were gathering wild wheat, but it led to this cultural center where people had enough food to gather for weeks or months at a time and build this ceremonial center. It's the oldest ceremonial center known, I think, on the planet, and it's based on gathering wild wheat. So grasses are infinitely interesting, and there is an article, I can send it to you if you want it, The Evolution of Grass, How It Changed the World. I forget how much I mentioned this last week, but the grasses pick up silica out of the soil and turn it into a different chemical form of silica that is soluble in water. And so then when the grass dies, the soluble silica goes into the water system, and some of it washes to the ocean. The amount of silica in the ocean has increased because of the widespread of the grass family on the face of the earth, over the planet. 40% of the Earth's terrestrial surface. Well, these are pictures of blooms off the coast of Vancouver Island on the left and off the coast of Alaska. Diatoms have to have silica. There is a relationship between the evolution of the grass family, the spread of the grass family, and the increase in diatoms in the ocean. Diatoms are photosynthetic algae that produce sugar, carbohydrates, but they're also releasing oxygen in the atmosphere. It's thought that diatoms produce 25% of the oxygen in the atmosphere that we breathe. So it's a good example of ecological relationships, the interconnection of life. Squash is easy to grow. It's a favorite thing of me to grow. It's very enthusiastic. I would say I held off. I wanted to plant it because it's so fun to put in. I wanted to plant it on April 1st. I held off because it grows too fast. It's cold, still cold in May. So I'm going to plant it on April 15th in pots in the house, in the windowsill. It'll come up in a week, grows fast. It'll go out into the cold frames in early May. And then maybe it cannot take frost, but you can cover it at first. Anyhow, late early June, put it out. So that's how I take care of squash. But where did squash come from? The interesting thing to me is, why did this evolve? And looking into it, so squashes produce wild cucurbits. The squash family produce a toxin that makes the plant poisonous to small vertebrates. So, but the seeds are encased in this big gourd. So why did it evolve? And the thinking is that it co-evolved with mastodons. And this is a picture, not of a mastodon, but of an elephant eating pumpkins. It's just interesting to get any background on how these plants evolved. And if you look this up, you'll find this is the thinking, that these squash family, which produces a toxin that keeps the small herbivores from eating it, the big herbivores can't eat it because it's dilute enough that it doesn't poison them. And so they would eat it and poop out the seeds and disperse the seeds. And, the seeds would be planted in mastodon manure, like a compost pile, and would grow more squash. And then humans selected to downgrade the bitter toxin in squashes and made them more edible. Soil biology primer. So this costs money. The other one I showed was free. This is $18, but it's very good. It's a booklet. It's not big, but it's got great information. And if you Google that, you can get access to it, I think, from the Soil Conservation Service, Soil Biology Primer. But this is from that. I did show this last week. But these numbers, the degree to which the soil is alive is just staggering. And so these are the numbers, the upper 1, 2, 3, 4 numbers of creatures, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes. That's a teaspoon of soil, up to 1 billion bacteria in a teaspoon of soil. And similarly, astonishing numbers of organisms. The soil is a living ecosystem. What is it eating? None of these are producers. These are all consumers. Well, we know what it's eating. It's eating the organic matter that life has created and put into the soil. So a related picture, the soil ecosystem with all these organisms. So the organic matter at the top is going into the soil, and it feeds this community of life that retains moisture and nutrients and cycles those nutrients so that they become available, recycled to the plants through the organisms in the soil. It's a big story. So then, you know, really, in a sense, the hardest nutrient to come up with is nitrogen. Arguably, I would say, arguably. So this is the percent nitrogen in different forms of manure. So it says percent N on the second column, percent phosphorus, percent potassium, which is represented as K because the P got taken up by phosphorus. Nitrogen's hard. Nitrogen volatilizes. It's not common in plant material. It's much more available in animal manure. So that's why we're looking at this. And obviously there's a little lead in here because human manure is high in nitrogen. Cattle's high. You know, all these things are high. Even 50% is great. I mean, we think chickens are low and it's 50. When we think chickens are high in nitrogen, oh, that's moisture. Nitrogen, yeah, chicken is high, but all these are relatively high. Cattle is actually the lowest on the list. So there's a great passage here where the author of the book, the Human Manure Handbook, he says, Rodale, Rodale Organic Gardener says, we need to add nitrogen to your compost pile to get the nitrogen ratio high. So you need to find a large mammal to come up with that nitrogen. But most of us don't have a large mammal around. And so Joseph Jenkins, who wrote the Human Manure Handbook, says, where can I find a large mammal? What a problem. And Jenkins says, well, why don't you look in the mirror? Because there's a large mammal. So this is a slightly uncomfortable topic, but this is deep ecology. This is deep ecology. And somehow the way we've grown up, we think that human manure is a waste product and it needs to be flushed away. And we put it actually into drinking water and we flushed it away. That's what Joseph Jenkins says in his book, the Human Manure Handbook. And so I thought I would just say, without wanting to dwell on this, it's not that we should recycle. It's not that we should compost our own human manure. It's that we could. And that it's really a step like decreasing the amount of plastic that we process. It's a step towards more ecological living. So that's the book. It's been out for 25 years. It is the best ecology book I've ever read. And I think the reason is it's applied ecology. We're not studying a shrub steppe ecosystem or a conifer ecosystem. It's how do we live on the planet in an ecological way. So I am recommending the book. And this is a little graphic out of the book. And it's full of humor. This is not necessarily funny, but it's sort of cartoony. So this is the broken cycle where we use chemical fertilizers and we do use chemical fertilizers. I mean, most agriculture, the nitrogen is chemically produced using natural gas, which is a fossil fuel, and it's very finite. Phosphorus is mined in just a few places in the world, like Florida and Morocco, and transported in ships. That's where our phosphorus comes from. And potassium, similar. And then we apply these chemical fertilizers, we eat it, and we throw it away. It's not sustainable. And I think part of improving our life on the planet and feeling better about being here is growing in an ecological direction. And this is part of that direction. Last slide. This, the planet, I don't think I even have anything to go with that. It's just a nice image of the intertwining of life and chemical composition, which is the organic matter going into the soil and the physical conditions, the rain and lack of rain and hot and cold weather, has created a planet unlike any in the solar system. I suspect it's, we're looking for extraterrestrial life. So excited about extraterrestrial life and less excited about the fact that this might be the only place in the universe that life exists. And we get to be here and interact with it and grow living things in our garden. What could be more exciting than that? So I think that's it. I didn't even put in a ending on this one. So there you have it.
That was great. And do you collect your manure?
Oh, yeah. Right. I would have talked about that if I'd remembered. I'm trying to remember. Stop share. So yeah, then you have to worry about, people are going to think you put that on your carrots. Well, I don't put it on my carrots. So I moved here 20 years ago, and for whatever reason, I mean, I grew up in San Francisco, and I was not oriented in this way, but I was part of the Back to the Land movement. Well, this is part of the Back to the Land movement, growing gardens, growing organic gardens. Part of that step is recycling the nutrients that give us our lives. I mean, there's some depth to it. It's not just humanure.
Yeah.
So when I moved here, I built a composting toilet. It's a pretty low tech. I'll put it that way. So it's an old. I bought a septic tank that was cracked for cheap, $100. Put it in the ground. Made 2 tanks out of it. So I don't want to go into the details, but it is a composting toilet. So when one tank is full, it took 12 years for me to fill that first tank. And now it's sitting there. So if you read something like the Human Neural Handbook, you'll learn that the detrimental organisms that can exist in human excrement only live 6 months outside the body. So if that humanure sits in that tank, and so when you use any composting toilet, you add plant matter, sawdust. You can have, I don't want to go into the details, but you can have a composting toilet in your house. If you add sawdust every time you go to the bathroom, there's no odor. It's like a magic trick, but you have to add the organic matter for the high nitrogen human manure, to break down. It's just like a compost pile. You're getting that carbon nitrogen ratio right. So yes, I have this low tech human manure, and I'm now digging out the first tank that sat there for 12 years, almost 12. Well, it sat there for quite a while, and there's no detrimental organisms in it. And I'm putting it on that field that needs organic matter, basically not growing food with it yet. And mostly because I know people because I sell at farmers market, and I tell them, that's why the carrots taste so good. But then I tell them it's a joke. It's not really why the carrots taste so good, because we wouldn't pretty jumpy about.
Yeah. There are some questions there.
Okay, thanks for the reminder. Or maybe they're arguments. So starting at the one, flashing keeps green voles out of your greenhouse, but how do you fight them in an open fenced garden? So voles are more of a problem than mice by far. Voles, are twice the size of a mouse, and they're very common. They're totally abundant in the Methow, and that's why we have these interesting raptors, the red-tailed hawks and great horned owls and animals like that. They're an important part of the ecosystem. But so the question is, how do you keep them out of the fenced garden? I don't have a big problem with them in the garden. In the garden, the problem that I have with them is when the carrots and beets in the fall. I think when the green stuff is starting to get less green in August and September, they start eating the tops of the carrots and the beets. And the problem for me is then I can't sell them. Nobody wants to buy something that a rodent has chewed on. It's a problem, actually, a small problem for me in that way. And mostly I start setting traps, but voles aren't that excited about mouse traps. A mouse will go to a mouse trap immediately. And you can even hit a vole with a mouse trap and it won't die because they're bigger. So I haven't solved that problem, but it's not like the greenhouse. When I planted in the greenhouse in March, it was snow outside. There was nothing for them to eat, and last year they ate everything in the greenhouse. So something here is good for a laugh. We don't know what it is. No-till gardening. Yeah. So I did talk about no-till gardening last week. Andy's asking about it, and it's like I was talking about mulch. There are pros and cons to every approach. I now till less, but I thought about this even in this regard and in this conversation. What I said about the corn, tilling that corn in with a tiller on a tractor saved me 20 hours of work, and it turned that corn right into the soil and it chopped it up. So it's too huge an advantage for me if you have that kind of equipment. But with my mantis that I mentioned, I till less because of this controversy. I am less worried about releasing carbon dioxide. To me, that's a natural cycle. Plants are made out of carbon dioxide. It came from the atmosphere. It's released back into the atmosphere. But I mentioned last week, you're breaking up the structure of the soil when you till. And that's frowned upon by the deep organic gardeners. I don't know, the structure that's made largely by the earthworms and is valuable to the community in the soil, including the roots, because it creates air spaces and allows water to percolate. You get a little aggregate structure in the soil. That's the way they talk about it. And Elliot Coleman, whom I talked about, highly recommended organic gardener in Maine, and his 3 books that I showed last week. He's no-till, pretty much no-till. So you can go either way. I till less now and not as deep, but I use a broad fork more to break, to lift that soil and get oxygen spaces into it. So Andy's recommending a book called Kiss the Ground, which I'm sure there are great books. The wheat photos was good for a laugh. Yeah, good. Yeah, I obviously staged that for fun.
I have a question about we get our manure from a farmer who has a lot of horses, and he has a tractor and he just dumps it, and we mix it with soil and put it on our garden in the fall. But I was thinking about where he gets the hay for his horses.
Yeah.
I don't know if that hay has been sprayed. I don't even know, do they spray hay? I assume they probably do. Do you ever worry about that?
Yeah, I do, but I don't know what to do about it. I've heard of people who have, I think what I've heard is they put the horse manure on their garden and the plants wouldn't grow because there was herbicides.
Well, I let the manure sit there for a couple of years before we actually use it.
Well, yeah. So farmers will spray hayfields when they plant alfalfa, and they plant a grass cover crop, a nurse crop, because alfalfa probably germinates slow and it grows slow. So at first you get grass, but there's alfalfa under it. They don't want weeds in there, and they spray it with herbicides. A week after the plants come up, and they spray it and kill the broadleaf plants. Some of them, I'm not quite sure how that works with alfalfa, but they did that. I saw him spray. When he planted. Oh yeah, he planted grass on the field that I drive in by, and they definitely sprayed herbicides on there. It stank. I didn't even want to drive by there. Anyhow, I don't know what you do. All you can do is ask. Try and find out what the background is. It is an issue to be aware of. And the herbicides are a big mistake. To be spraying poisons on our agricultural fields is just an absurdity.
My plants, I have a good garden. I don't know if that means anything, but I wonder if the chemicals dissipate over time, in the manure, or
yeah, they break down.
Yeah.
And I think the organic activity, I haven't seen it said, the organic activity in the soil will help break that down. faster. And there'll be an organism that'll figure out how to deal with that chemical, but it could take time, and you really don't want poisons in your soil.
Right. And I've been getting that manure for a long time. Is anybody
Jamie,
else
can I
have
ask you a question about
Yeah.
wood chips?
Wood chips.
Yeah. Two questions about wood chips.
Yeah.
Would you use it for mulching? And have you ever grown potatoes in wood chips?
Interesting question. The problem with wood chips is they're full of lignin. They don't break down very easily, and they aren't broken down at all. And so if you put an organic substance on the soil, even any mulch like straw or hay, it's going to take a little nitrogen out of the soil, because the bacteria that break down the organic matter take nitrogen out of the soil. So wood chips are going to do that more because they haven't broken down at all, and they're hard to break down. And so there's controversy about using wood chips. I don't know if you've seen, there's somebody over, I think he's on the Olympic Peninsula, who just swears by wood chips. But I think the thing is, you would get a layer of broken down material after a few years. But the first year, I would be very hesitant to use wood chips. Now on potatoes, I mean, the potato itself is down further in the ground, but the plant has to deal with the chemistry of the soil surface. Try it and see. There are disadvantages to wood chips in the way that I just said. They're a tough organic material. That will not break down quickly. So I got access to sawdust last September at somebody's little sawmill down on Benson Creek, and I got 5 trailer loads of sawdust, and I threw one trailer load on each compost pile as a thin layer, and I threw the rest on that very same field where I grew where I put the humanure, and I grow the rye, because it has time to break down. In fact, I even got some of those wood chips from where they're putting the new ditch in, and they actually ground up cottonwood trees. If you can imagine that they have the power to grind up cottonwood trees. So it's wood chips. I wouldn't put that in the garden, because it would steal nitrogen from the garden. But I put it on the soil because I got all the time in the world for that soil. I'm just trying to improve that soil. You know, the next generation can have better soil. That's fine with me.
My husband's a
I might get mushrooms, because it's fungi that break down.
My husband's a woodworker, and I put sawdust on my raspberries and strawberries every year.
I do too.
Seems to work.
But there's a little bit of acidity in sawdust, especially if it's conifer sawdust. But raspberries like acid soil. Yeah, sawdust is great probably for strawberries, certainly for raspberries and blueberries.
So I have a question.
Yes, please.
So we're thinking about growing more potatoes this year, and rather than mound them, some people we know use tires to build up and the question is whether or not tires will leach into the soil and have any material in them that is not healthy.
Yeah.
Any ideas on that?
Yeah, my best answer to these questions is always Google it.
Yeah.
So I have seen that discussed, and it would work well.